300 years before Game of Thrones, the Seven Kingdoms were just that, 7 realms, divided by pride and blood, until one man had a dream of fire and of something far colder. Aegon Targaryen saw darkness coming, a winter that would consume everything unless the kingdoms stood together. So he rose from Dragonstone, with his sisters by his side, and 3 dragons beneath his command. When he landed on the shores of Westeros, no one yet knew. The world was about to end and begin again. How did Aegon turn a dream into an empire? Why did some kings burn while others bend the knee? And what secret did he carry? The one that still echoes in the blood of every Targaryen that came after. If stories of dragons, destiny, and the forgotten past of Westeros fascinate you, leave a like and subscribe for more tales from the Age of Fire. Now, let's begin. Before we talk about conquest, we need to talk about a nightmare that changed everything. Aegon Targaryen woke in darkness on Dragonstone, his heart pounding against his ribs, sweat cold on his skin despite the warm summer night. The dream clung to him like smoke. He'd seen winter, not the gentle snows that fell south of the neck, but a true winter, the kind that hadn't come in 8,000 years, a winter that would last a generation, an endless night where the sun rose but gave no warmth, where the winds howled with voices that weren't human, where something ancient and evil marched south with an army that couldn't die. In the dream, Aegon had stood on the wall, that massive barrier of ice in the far north, and watched them come. Creatures with eyes like blue stars, dead men walking with swords in their hands and no breath in their lungs. Things that had been men once, but were now something else, something wrong. And behind them, riding dead horses, came the others, the White Walkers from the oldest stories, the ones nursemaids used to frighten children. Except in Aegon's dream, they weren't stories. They were real, and they were coming. But the worst part of the dream wasn't the army of the dead. It was what came after. Aegon saw the 7 kingdoms fighting each other while the real enemy approached. He saw kings squabbling over borders and titles while humanity died. He saw castles burning, but not from dragonfire, from cold blue flames that froze instead of burned. He saw the last desperate battles, scattered and uncoordinated, each kingdom falling alone because they'd never learned to stand together. And then, at the very end of the dream, Aegon saw something else. A possibility, not a certainty. 7 kingdoms united under one crown, one realm, one purpose, one army standing together at the wall when the darkness came. Dragons and men fighting side by side against the cold. It wouldn't be easy, it wouldn't be perfect, but it would be enough. Humanity would survive if someone united them first. Aegon had always known he was a dreamer. His family was famous for it. The dragon dreams, they called them. Visions that came to certain Targaryens, showing them things that hadn't happened yet, but would. His ancestor Daenerys the Dreamer had seen the doom of Valyria 12 years before it happened, and her warning had saved House Targaryen from extinction. Aegon's dreams had been vague before. Impressions, feelings, brief glimpses. This was different. This was clear and specific and terrifying. This was a message, a purpose, a command from fate itself. He sat up in bed, breathing hard, and knew with absolute certainty that the dream was true. The long night was coming again. Maybe not this year or next. Maybe not in his lifetime, but it was coming, as surely as winter followed summer. And when it came, the 7 kingdoms would need to be one kingdom, united and strong, ready to face an enemy that couldn't be negotiated with, or bought off, or reasoned with. An enemy that could only be fought with fire and steel and the combined strength of all humanity. The first lords to face Aegon's army made a crucial mistake. They forgot about the dragons. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. First, Aegon had to convince his sister wives that he wasn't mad. Visenya and Rhaenys were as different as summer and winter, but Aegon loved them both. Visenya was the elder, tall and stern, with a sharp face and sharper mind. She wore her hair in a long braid, wrapped around her head like a crown. She practiced with her sword every morning. Dark sister, the Valyrian steel blade that had been in their family for generations. She was a warrior, cold and calculating, the kind of person who thought 3 moves ahead in every situation. When Aegon told her about the dream, she believed him immediately. Visenya understood duty and destiny. If the dragon dream said they had to conquer Westeros, then they would conquer Westeros. Rhaenys was different. She was younger, softer, with dark eyes that sparkled when she smiled. She loved music and poetry. She wore flowing dresses in bright colors and spent her time with singers and storytellers. Common people adored her. She had a warmth about her, a gentleness that made everyone around her feel safe and welcome. When Aegon told her about the dream, she cried, not because she didn't believe him, she did, but because she understood what it would cost. Thousands would die, kingdoms would burn, families would be torn apart, all for a threat that might not come for hundreds of years. But she agreed anyway, because she loved Aegon and trusted his visions, and because saving humanity was worth any price. They were married in the tradition of old Valyria, where the blood of dragons stayed pure by marrying brother to sister. Aegon had wed both his sisters in a single ceremony, standing before a sept with Valyrian customs mixed with the faith of the 7. Some called it wrong, some called it abomination. The Targaryens called it necessary. They were the last dragon lords in all the world, and the dragons only bonded with those who had the blood. They couldn't risk diluting that blood by marrying outsiders. Besides, in old Valyria, this had been normal, expected even. The greatest dragon lord families had practiced sibling marriage for 5,000 years. Together, the three of them made their plans. They studied maps of Westeros, learning every castle, every river, every mountain pass. They sent spies to the courts of the Seven Kingdoms, gathering information about the kings and their strengths and weaknesses. They trained their dragons, teaching them to respond to horn signals and hand commands. They built ships and gathered soldiers from the small population of Dragonstone. They prepared for 2 years, planning every detail. Aegon knew they couldn't just show up and demand submission. They needed to demonstrate power first, make it clear that resistance was hopeless. They needed to be generous in victory, showing that life under Targaryen rule would be better than the constant warfare the kingdoms had endured for thousands of years. They needed to move fast before the kingdoms could fully unite against them. And most importantly, they needed to seem inevitable, like the tide or the seasons, something that couldn't be stopped or reasoned with, only accepted. On the day they left Dragonstone, the sun rose red over the narrow sea, turning the water to blood. 3 dragons took flight. Balerion, the Black Dread, ridden by Aegon, was the largest living creature in the world. His wingspan was so vast that his shadow could cover entire towns. When he flew over villages, people looked up and thought they'd gone blind because the sky had disappeared. His teeth were as long as swords, his claws could tear through castle walls, and his fire burned black and red like the hot coals at the heart of a forge. Balerion was old, maybe 200 years, though no one knew for certain. He'd been born in Valyria before the Doom. He remembered the Freehold. He was the last living creature that did. Vhagar, bonded to Visenya, was younger but still massive. She had green and bronze scales that gleamed in the sunlight. She was fast and aggressive, always eager to fight. Visenya matched her perfectly. Both were warriors, both preferred action to words. Both were patient when planning, but savage when the time came to strike. Together, they were the sword of the conquest, the blade that would cut through anyone who stood in their way. Meraxes, Rhaenys' dragon, was the smallest of the 3, but still terrifyingly large. She was beautiful, with silver and gold scales that shimmered like jewelry. She was playful and curious, often flying down to investigate interesting sights. Rhaenys loved her deeply, and the dragon returned that love. Meraxes was the heart of the conquest, representing what the Targaryens wanted to build. Not just destruction, but beauty and wonder, and something worth protecting. Together, the 3 dragons crossed the narrow sea and approached the mouth of the Blackwater Rush. They'd chosen this spot carefully. It was near King's Landing, though that name didn't exist yet. The land was wild and mostly empty, with just a few fishing villages scattered along the shore. 3 hills rose from the land near the water. They were bare and rocky, with scrub grass and wildflowers growing between the stones. Nothing special, nothing important. But Aegon had seen them in his dreams, and he knew this was where the new realm would begin. The dragons landed on the 3 hills. Balerion took the highest, his black scales drinking in the sunlight. Vhagar claimed the 2nd hill to the north. Meraxes settled on the 3rd, her golden scales glittering. The fishermen who lived nearby watched from their boats, too afraid to approach. They'd never seen dragons before. Most people in Westeros hadn't. Dragons were legends, stories from the east, things that didn't exist anymore. Except now they were real, and they were here. Aegon dismounted and planted his banner in the rocky soil, a 3-headed red dragon on a black field. The banner snapped in the wind coming off the Blackwater. Visenya and Rhaenys joined him. Together they built a simple wooden fort on the highest hill, using timber cut from the nearby woods and stone hauled up from the beach. It was crude and basic, but it was defensible. More importantly, it was a statement. We're not visitors, we're staying. Then Aegon sent out his message. He had copies made and sent to every castle and holdfast within 100 miles. The message was direct and simple. I am Aegon of House Targaryen. I've come to unite the 7 kingdoms. From this day forward, there's only one king in Westeros. You have a choice. Bend the knee, swear your loyalty, and you may keep your lands and titles. You'll be judged on your merit and service, not on whether you fought against me. Refuse and face the dragons. The choice is yours, but choose quickly. The first lords to respond were the smart ones. Lord Rosby and Lord Stokeworth ruled small holdings south of where the future King's Landing would stand. They weren't powerful or rich. They'd spent their entire lives caught between larger kingdoms, forced to pick sides in wars that weren't their own. When they received Aegon's message, they looked at each other and came to the same conclusion. This was their chance to be on the winning side for once. They rode to Aegon's fort with their household knights, maybe 50 men total between them. When they arrived, the 3 dragons were sleeping on the hills, huge and terrible even in rest. Valyrian's breathing sounded like wind through a canyon. Vhagar's tail was coiled around her hill twice. Merax's had one golden eye open, watching the approaching men with lazy curiosity. The lords took one look, got down from their horses, and knelt in the dirt. They swore their oaths right there, promising loyalty to House Targaryen forever. Aegon accepted graciously, raised them up, confirmed them in their lands and titles, and sent them home. The first two lords of the Seven Kingdoms had submitted without a single drop of blood spilled. Word spread fast. Two other lords, Darklyn of Duskendale and Mooten of Maidenpool, decided they needed to test whether these dragons were really as dangerous as the story suggested. Maybe Rosby and Stokeworth were cowards. Maybe the dragons were old and slow. Maybe Aegon's army was weak. They gathered their forces, maybe 3,000 men total, and marched south together. If they could defeat the Targaryens now, before the invasion really began, they'd be heroes. Every kingdom would thank them. Songs would be written about their victory. They were wrong. The two armies met in the fields south of the Blackwater, near where the Kingswood would someday grow. It started like a normal battle. Infantry lines crashed together. Knights charged. Archers fired. For about 10 minutes, it looked like Darklyn and Mooten might actually win. Aegon's forces were outnumbered. The Targaryen soldiers were well trained, but not exceptional. This was going to be a grinding, bloody fight that could go either way. Then the shadow passed overhead. Soldiers on both sides looked up. The sky had gone dark, not with clouds, with wings. Valyrian descended like a thunderstorm made flesh. He was so large that men couldn't process what they were seeing. Their minds couldn't accept that a living creature could be that massive. He opened his jaws, and fire poured out. This wasn't ordinary fire. This was dragon fire, hotter than any forge, burning black and red like metal in a smith's furnace. It didn't just burn things, it melted them. Stone cracked, metal ran like water. Men didn't have time to scream. The flames washed over the Darklyn and Mooten lines like a wave. And when it passed, there was only ash and charred earth where hundreds of men had been standing. The battle broke instantly. Soldiers threw down their weapons and ran. Knights abandoned their horses. The neat battle lines dissolved into chaos as everyone scattered in every direction, desperate to get away from the dragon. Valyrian circled once, roaring, a sound like thunder mixed with grinding stone, so loud it hurt to hear, and then landed in the middle of the field. He was daring anyone to come near. No one did. Lord Darklyn and Lord Mooten were dragged before Aegon by their own men, who'd decided that surrendering was better than dying. The two lords expected to be executed. Instead, Aegon looked at them calmly and asked a simple question. Will you kneel? They fell to their knees so fast they bruised themselves on the rocks. They swore their oaths, promised their loyalty, begged for mercy. Aegon granted it without hesitation. He'd made a promise in his message. Those who bent the knee would be forgiven. He kept that promise. The lords went home, chastened but alive, and told everyone they met about what they'd seen. That night, Aegon sat with his sisters around a fire in the wooden fort. The fort didn't have a name yet, but it would eventually be called the Aegon Fort. They talked about what came next. The easy conquests were done. Now they'd face real kingdoms with real armies. Visenya wanted to strike north at the Riverlands, which were ruled by Harren the Black. Rhaenys thought they should secure the south first, dealing with the Storm King. Aegon listened to both and made his decision. They would do both at once. He would fly north to deal with Harren. Rhaenys would fly south to face the Storm King. Visenya would stay here, holding the Aegon Fort, and accepting the submission of any other nearby lords. Before they separated, they held a ceremony. It was a mix of Valyrian tradition and something new Aegon had invented. They each cut their palms with Valyrian steel daggers, letting their blood drip into a bowl. They mixed it together and smeared it on their foreheads, marking themselves with the symbol of the three-headed dragon. They swore an oath to each other, not to the seven, not to the old gods, but to each other and to the mission. They would unite the seven kingdoms. They would build something that would last. They would prepare Westeros for the darkness that was coming. And they would do it together, the three heads of the dragon, now and forever. As they spoke their vows, the three dragons lifted their heads and roared in unison. The sound echoed across the Blackwater and into the hills beyond. Fishermen in their villages heard it and shivered. Lords in their castles heard it and began to worry. The conquest had truly begun. But to understand why Aegon had dragons at all, we need to go back further, to a doomed city across the narrow sea. The greatest empire the world had ever seen was about to die, and only one family knew it was coming. 5,000 years before Aegon landed at the mouth of the Blackwater, shepherds in the eastern hills of Essos found dragons nesting in the volcanoes of the Valyrian Peninsula. They were wild and dangerous, but the shepherds were brave and clever. They learned to approach the dragons, to feed them, to earn their trust. Eventually, they learned to ride them. That discovery changed the world. The Valyrian freehold rose from those volcanic hills and spread across half of Essos. At its height, Valyria controlled everything from the Summer Sea to Slaver's Bay, from the Dothraki Sea to the Narrow Sea. It was the greatest civilization that had ever existed. The Valyrians built roads of fused stone that never crumbled, roads that still exist today, 500 years after the freehold fell, they raised towers 1,000 feet high, slender and graceful, using magic and dragon fire to shape stone like clay. They practiced blood magic and fire sorcery. Their scholars discovered secrets that have been lost forever, and they made Valyrian steel. The process was a closely guarded secret, lost when Valyria died. The steel was lighter than normal, metal but stronger, sharp enough to cut through normal swords, beautiful enough to be art. Each blade was unique, with ripples and patterns folded into the metal that never repeated. Making Valyrian steel required dragon fire and blood magic and skills that no longer exist. There are maybe 200 Valyrian steel weapons left in the world, and every single one is priceless. The freehold wasn't ruled by a king or queen. Instead, it was controlled by 40 Dragonlord families, ancient houses that had mastered dragons and used them to enforce their will. They met in a great council to decide policy and make laws. They fought each other constantly through politics and intrigue and occasional violence, but they always united against outside threats. Together, they were unstoppable. Their dragons made them invincible. For 5,000 years, Valyria conquered everyone who opposed them and crushed anyone who tried to rebel. House Targaryen was one of those 40 families, but they weren't important. They didn't sit on the high council. They weren't among the richest or most powerful. They had modest estates on the eastern edge of Valyria, close to the coast. They bred dragons and served the freehold loyally, but no one would have remembered their name if not for a 12-year-old girl named Rhaenys. Rhaenys was the daughter of Lord Aegon Targaryen. She was small and quiet, the kind of child who spent more time reading than playing. She loved dragons and spent hours watching them fly. She had the silver gold hair and purple eyes that marked all Valyrians, the signs of the ancient blood. She seemed completely normal until the dream started. At first, her family thought she had a fever. She woke up screaming in the middle of the night, crying about fire and death. Her mother held her and soothed her and told her it was just nightmares, but the dreams kept coming, night after night, always the same. Rhaenys saw Valyria burning. She saw the ground splitting open. She saw mountains exploding. She saw dragons falling from the sky in flames. She saw the greatest city in the world drowning in fire and ash, and she saw her family dying with everyone else. The dreams were so vivid, so detailed, that Rhaenys started drawing them. She filled scrolls with sketches, the 14 flames erupting, the towers collapsing, the streets filling with lava. Her father found the drawings and brought in healers and priests. They examined Rhaenys and found nothing wrong with her body. One old priest, wiser than the others, suggested that maybe the dreams were real. Maybe Rhaenys was a dreamer, blessed or cursed with visions of the future. The Targaryens had a history of dreamers. Every few generations, someone in the family would have prophetic dreams. Most of the dreams were vague and symbolic, hard to interpret, but sometimes, rarely, a dreamer would see something specific, something that was definitely going to happen. The family called these people dragon dreamers, and they took their visions seriously. Rhaenys told her father everything. She described the doom in detail, how the ground would shake for days before it happened, how the sea would retreat from the shore, how animals would flee the city, and she told him when it would happen. Not the exact day, but close enough. 12 years from now, she said, maybe a little less, Valyria will end. Lord Aegon Targaryen faced an impossible choice. If he believed his daughter, he had to abandon everything. Their estates, their position, their entire life. He'd have to leave Valyria and look like a coward and a madman. The other Dragonlord families would mock him forever. His own family might refuse to follow him. If he was wrong, if Rhaenys' dreams were just nightmares, he'd throw away everything they'd built for nothing. But if he didn't believe her, and she was right, his entire family would die. Every Targaryen would burn. The dragons they'd spent generations breeding would perish. Their name would be erased from history. The choice was stark: risk humiliation or risk extinction. Aegon believed his daughter. He spent the next year quietly selling their estates, gathering their wealth, preparing their dragons for a long flight. He told the other Dragonlord families that he was retiring, moving to a quieter life on the edge of the Empire. Some thought he was sick. Some thought he'd gone mad. Most just didn't care. The Targaryens weren't important enough for anyone to worry about. Aegon took his entire household, his wife, his children, his relatives, his servants, his guards, and sailed west across the narrow sea. He brought 5 dragons with him, including Balerion, who was just a hatchling at the time. They settled on Dragonstone, a volcanic island off the coast of Westeros. It was isolated and lonely, surrounded by sharp rocks and crashing waves. The castle was ancient, carved from the black stone of the volcano, with dragon-shaped towers and gargoyles. It was beautiful in a harsh, forbidding way. The Valyrians called Aegon the exile. They laughed at him for running away because a child had bad dreams. For 12 years, messengers came from Valyria asking when he was coming home. Enar always sent the same reply, not yet. He watched his daughter carefully. The dreams continued. Daenerys grew into a young woman, serious and haunted, certain of what she'd seen. Enar never doubted her. Then 12 years after they'd left, the doom came. For over a century, the Targaryens waited on Dragonstone, watching Westeros, preparing. No one knows exactly what happened. The best records come from sailors who were far at sea when it occurred, and maesters who pieced together accounts from survivors at the edges of the disaster. The most common theory is that the fire mages of Valyria pushed too hard. They'd been using blood magic to control the 14 flames, the massive volcanoes beneath the city, harnessing their power for sorcery and industry. Maybe they made a mistake. Maybe they grew overconfident. Maybe something went wrong with a spell. Whatever the cause, the volcanoes erupted. Not just one, all 14, simultaneously. The ground cracked open in 1,000 places. Lakes of fire poured across the peninsula. The city of Valyria, with its soaring towers and fused stone roads, melted. The heat was so intense that stone liquefied, metal vaporized, the air itself caught fire. Ash and smoke rose so high they blotted out the sun across half of Essos. The earthquakes were felt as far away as Westeros. Tsunamis generated by the eruptions drowned coastal cities 100 miles away. The dragons of Valyria, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, died. Some burned in the fires, some suffocated in the ash-filled air. Some simply fell from the sky as the magic that gave them strength failed. The Dragonlord families, all 40 of them except the Targaryens, perished. Every member of every house, gone in a single day. 5,000 years of civilization ended between sunrise and sunset. The ruins of Valyria are still there, in the center of what's now called the Smoking Sea. The water boils, strange fogs roll across the surface, carrying diseases that kill anyone who breathes them. Demons and twisted creatures are said to live in the ruins. Pirates and treasure hunters occasionally try to sail into the Smoking Sea to recover Valyrian steel, or gold, or artifacts. Most never return. Those who do come back changed, sick, mad, or worse. The Targaryens, far away on Dragonstone, were the only Dragonlord family to survive. They were suddenly precious beyond measure. They had the only remaining dragons in the world. They had the last of the old Valyrian blood, pure and undiluted. They had knowledge and magic that would otherwise be lost forever. But they were also isolated and vulnerable. The last ember of a dead civilization, desperately trying not to be extinguished. The century after the doom was chaos. Historians call it the Century of Blood, and the name fits perfectly. Without Valyria to maintain order, every power in Essos went to war. Volantis tried to rebuild the freehold and conquer everyone else. The free cities fought each other. Slavers raided everywhere. New kingdoms rose and fell in a generation. The Dothraki horse lords swept across the plains, burning cities and taking slaves. Diseases spread. Famines killed millions. It was a dark, terrible time. The Targaryens stayed out of it. They'd learned their lesson. Getting involved in other people's wars was how you got killed. They fortified Dragonstone, making it impregnable. They formed alliances with 2 other families who'd fled Valyria before the doom, the Valerians, who had powerful ships, and the Celtigars, who had wealth and knowledge. Together, the 3 houses created a small but stable realm in the narrow sea, and they watched Westeros. From Dragonstone, you could see the mainland on a clear day. The Targaryens studied the 7 kingdoms carefully, learning everything they could. They saw the constant warfare, the shifting alliances, the rise and fall of dynasties. They saw kings grow old and weak, kingdoms fragment, opportunities appear and disappear. Several times, different Targaryens proposed invading Westeros. Aegon's grandfather considered it. His father, Lord Arion, actually drew up plans for a conquest, but died before he could attempt it. Aegon inherited those plans along with the lordship of Dragonstone. He was 27 years old when his father died, already married to both his sisters, already an experienced dragon rider. He could have lived a quiet life on Dragonstone, ruling his island, staying out of everyone's way. The Targaryens were safe there. They were the last Dragonlords, precious and protected, keepers of the old knowledge. But then Aegon had his dream, and everything changed. When Aegon finally moved, it was because the Storm King made the mistake of insulting him. Argilac Durrandon, called Argilac the Arrogant by those who didn't like him, and Argilac the Storm King by those who did, was one of the most powerful rulers in Westeros. He was 70 years old, and he'd been king for most of his life. In his youth, he'd been a legendary warrior, feared across the Stormlands and beyond. He'd fought in 20 battles and won 19 of them. He'd killed 3 men in single combat during his coronation ceremony, just to prove he was worthy of the crown. Songs were written about his strength and courage, but that was 50 years ago. Now Argilac was old. His hair was white, his face was lined with age, and his hands shook when he held a sword. He could still fight. He practiced every day, but he was slower than he used to be. His joints ached in the morning. His eyes weren't as sharp. He knew he was fading, and it made him angry. Old age felt like an insult to a man who'd spent his entire life being strong. Argilax's kingdom, the Stormlands, stretched from the Dornish marches to the Riverlands. His castle, Storm's End, was a massive round fortress on the coast, built by legends to have been raised by Bran the Builder with help from the Children of the Forest. The walls were 100 feet high and 40 feet thick. No army had ever taken Storm's End by force. It had stood for thousands of years through countless wars and never fallen. But Argilax had a problem. To his north, King Harren of the Isles and Rivers had been conquering the Riverlands. Harren was cruel and powerful, and he'd just finished building Harrenhal, the largest castle anyone had ever seen. Harren had thousands of soldiers and controlled the iron mines of the Iron Islands, plus all the rich lands along the Trident. He was becoming too powerful, and Argilax knew it. If Harren kept growing stronger, eventually he'd turn south and attack the Stormlands. Argilax needed an ally. He needed someone strong enough to fight Harren, but not so strong that they'd become a threat themselves. He looked across the narrow sea to Dragonstone and saw the Targaryens. They had dragons, which would be useful. They had a small army, which meant they'd need his help. And they were foreigners, which meant they probably didn't have ambitions in Westeros. Perfect. So Argilax sent a message to Aegon Targaryen with an offer. Marry my daughter Argella, and I'll give you all the lands along the coast of the Narrow Sea as a dowry. From the Blackwater south to Massey's Hook, it's good land, rich and fertile. In exchange, help me fight Harren. Together we'll destroy him, and then you can go back to Dragonstone with your new wife and your new lands. It wasn't a terrible offer, objectively. Argella was supposed to be beautiful and clever. The lands were valuable. The alliance with the Storm King would be powerful. Any normal lord would have jumped at the chance. But Aegon wasn't a normal lord, and he didn't want just a piece of Westeros. He wanted all of it. Aegon sent back a different proposal. He would accept Argilax's daughter, but not for himself. For his friend and champion, Orys Baratheon. Orys was Aegon's closest companion, probably his bastard half-brother, though no one ever confirmed it. He was a skilled warrior and a clever tactician, loyal and trustworthy. He deserved a good marriage. As for the lands, Aegon didn't want a small strip of coast. He wanted the entire Stormlands. All Argilax had to do was bend the knee, swear loyalty, and he could keep everything else. His castle, his title, his wealth, his life. Just acknowledge that Aegon was the king now. The messenger arrived back at Storm's End with Aegon's reply. Argilax read it and turned purple with rage. Who did this Targaryen upstart think he was? Argilax was a king. His family had ruled the Stormlands for 1,000 years. He'd fought 20 battles. And this boy from Dragonstone, this nobody with some pet lizards, thought he could just show up and demand submission? It was insulting beyond words. Argilax had the messenger's hands cut off and sent him back to Dragonstone that way. He included his own message. Tell your bastard master that I spit on his offer. Tell him the Stormlands belong to House Durrandon, now and always. Tell him if he sets foot in my kingdom, I'll kill him myself and feed his dragons to the pigs. Tell him his sisters are whores, and he's the son of a whore himself, and his whole family should have died with the rest of Valyria. It was possibly the worst diplomatic mistake in the history of Westeros. Aegon had been planning to invade anyway. He needed to unite the Seven Kingdoms to prepare for the long night. But he'd been deciding which kingdom to strike first. Should he go north to the Riverlands, south to the Reach, west to the Rock? Each had advantages and disadvantages. Argilax made the choice for him. You don't cut off a messenger's hands and insult a man's family without consequences. Aegon called his war council. Rhaenys would take Meraxes and the bulk of their army south to engage Argilax. Aegon himself would fly north to deal with Harren the Black. Visenya would stay at the Aegon fort, consolidating their hold on the lands around the Blackwater. They would hit 2 kingdoms at once, fast and hard, before anyone could organize a coordinated defense. But before Aegon headed north, something else happened. A message arrived from the Riverlands, carried by a man who'd ridden 3 horses to death, getting there quickly. The message was from Edmund Tully, one of the most powerful lords of the Trident. It said, "Come now, we're ready to rise against Harren. Give us a banner to rally to, and we'll give you a kingdom." This was the opportunity Aegon had been waiting for. Harren the Black wasn't just a cruel king, he was hated. Hated by his own people, hated by everyone he'd conquered, hated even by his own family. If Aegon could turn the River Lords against Harren, he wouldn't even need to fight a war. The kingdom would collapse from within. It was brilliant. Harren the Black built the largest fortress anyone had ever seen. He made one miscalculation. He forgot that dragons fly. Harrenhal was called the Black, not because of his hair color, but because of his deeds. He was cruel for the sake of being cruel. He enjoyed hurting people. He took pleasure in making others suffer. When he conquered the Riverlands 30 years earlier, he'd brutalized the population into into submission. Villages that resisted were burned. Lords who defied him were tortured to death in creative ways. Families were torn apart, with children taken as hostages to ensure loyalty. Harren ruled the Iron Islands and the Riverlands, making him king of the isles and rivers. The Ironborn worshipped the drowned god and practiced the old way, reaving and raiding and taking what they wanted by force. They were hard people from a hard land, and Harren was the hardest of them all. He had dozens of sons and daughters from multiple wives, and even more mistresses. He played them against each other, rewarding cruelty and punishing kindness. Only the most ruthless of his children survived to adulthood. For 40 years, Harren worked on his great castle. He called it Harrenhal, and it was meant to be his masterpiece, the monument that would make him immortal. Every lord in the Riverlands was forced to contribute. Houses with forests had to send timber. Houses near quarries had to send stone. Every able-bodied man who couldn't pay taxes with goods had to pay with labor. Thousands of men spent their entire lives building Harrenhal. Many died in the construction, falling from scaffolds, crushed under stones, worked to death by brutal overseers. The castle rose on the northern shore of the God's Eye, the largest lake in the southern Riverlands. It was massive beyond belief. 5 colossal towers, each one large enough to hold an entire castle inside it. Walls 100 feet high and 40 feet thick. A great hall so vast you could fit all the people of a large town inside it. Courtyards big enough to hold a battlefield. Enough space to house 10,000 men comfortably, with room for horses and supplies and everything an army might need. Harren spared no expense. The timber came from the Kingswood. The stone came from the finest quarries. The iron for the gates and portcullises was the best the Iron Islands could produce. The glass for the windows, and there were thousands of windows, was imported from Myr. Harren hired the best builders, the most skilled masons, the cleverest architects. He wanted Harrenhal to be perfect, and he didn't care how much it cost, or how many people died making it. When it was finally complete, Harren stood on the battlements and looked out over his kingdom. He was 62 years old. He'd spent his entire adult life building this place. It was the largest, strongest castle in Westeros, possibly in the known world. No army could take it. The walls were too high, too thick. The gates were too strong. He had enough food stored to survive a 10-year siege. Enough fresh water from wells deep beneath the castle to last even longer. Any king who tried to take Harrenhal would waste his entire army on the walls and achieve nothing. Harren declared that he would rule from Harrenhal for 1,000 years. And his descendants would rule for 1,000 years after that. House Hoare would become the greatest dynasty in history, all because of this castle. He was so confident, so certain, that he barely bothered fortifying the rest of his kingdom. Why would he need to? No one could touch him. He forgot 3 things. First, he forgot that the people he ruled hated him. Second, he forgot that ambition and cruelty make enemies faster than strength makes friends. And third, most crucially, he forgot that dragons fly. As Harrenhal began to melt, the Riverlords realized Aegon wasn't like their old king. The message from Edmund Tully reached Aegon the same day Harren finished the last tower of Harrenhal. The timing was almost poetic. Harren had poured everything into his castle, believing it made him invincible. Meanwhile, the lords he'd brutalized for decades were reaching out to a foreign invader, begging him to come and free them. Harren didn't know it yet, but his kingdom was already crumbling. Aegon gathered his forces. He didn't have a large army, maybe 4,000 men who'd bent the knee already, plus a few hundred Targaryen loyalists from Dragonstone. But he had Balerion, and that was enough. They marched north up the coast, moving quickly, accepting the surrender of every castle and holdfast they passed. The lords of the Crownlands, seeing which way the wind was blowing, hurried to swear their loyalty. Within 2 weeks, Aegon controlled everything from the Blackwater to Maidenpool. Edmund Tully met him at Maidenpool with 3,000 Riverlords and their men. Tully was a proud man in his 50s, broad-shouldered and strong, with red hair going gray at the temples. He knelt to Aegon and declared himself in rebellion against Harren the Black. Other Riverlords followed, Blackwood and Bracken and Vance and Mooten, and dozens of smaller houses. They all had the same story. Harren had brutalized them, and they wanted revenge. Aegon asked them a simple question. Why now? Harren has ruled you for 30 years. Why betray him today? Edmund Tully's answer was honest. Because today, we think we can win. We've been waiting for someone strong enough to stand against him. You have a dragon. That makes you strong enough. Aegon accepted their oaths and made them a promise. If he won, Tully would be named Lord Paramount of the Trident, ruling all the Riverlands in Aegon's name. The other lords would keep their lands and titles. Harren's cruelty would end. There would be peace and justice instead of tyranny. The Riverlords liked what they heard. They'd been looking for a reason to rise up, and now they had one. The combined army marched to Harrenhal. When they arrived, Harren was standing on his battlements, looking down at them with contempt. 8,000 men stood before his walls. He had twice that inside the castle, all ironborn, all loyal, all trained fighters. The siege could last years. Aegon's army would starve, or freeze, or grow frustrated and leave. Harren couldn't lose. Aegon sent a messenger under a white banner of truce. The message was simple. Surrender now. Open your gates, swear your loyalty, and you may keep your life and your lands. Fight, and you'll die tonight." Harren's response became famous. He stood on the battlements and shouted down so everyone could hear, "I built this castle in 40 years. You will not take it in 40 lifetimes. Stone does not burn. Harrenhal is impregnable. Come and die on my walls, Dragon Lord." Aegon said nothing. He simply turned, walked back to his camp, and waited for the sun to set. While Harren burned in his great hall, another king was marching south to meet Aegon, face to face in open battle. As the sun touched the horizon and the sky turned red, Aegon climbed onto Balerian's back. The dragon lifted into the air, circling once over the army, then turned toward Harrenhal. Harren watched from his battlements, still confident. What could a dragon do against 100 feet of solid stone? The answer was everything. Balerion flew low over the castle, so close that people on the walls could feel the heat radiating from his body. Then he opened his jaws and released fire. This wasn't the fire from stories. This was dragon fire, burning hotter than any forge. Hotter than volcanic lava, hot enough to melt stone. The flames washed over the nearest tower, and the stone began to glow. First red, then orange, then yellow, then white hot. The tower didn't crumble, it melted. The stone turned soft like candle wax and began to sag and flow. The timber inside caught fire instantly, becoming torches that lit the interior. The heat spread through the tower, turning it into an oven. The men inside, Harren's, guards, his servants, his soldiers, tried to escape. Most couldn't. The heat was too intense. The smoke was too thick. The stairs had become rivers of molten stone. Those who made it to the windows jumped, choosing a quick death from the fall over burning. Balerion circled the castle, breathing fire on all 5 towers in turn. Within an hour, all 5 were glowing like coals. The walls radiated heat so intense that people standing 100 yards away felt their skin burn. Inside the castle, it was an inferno. Harren and his sons retreated to the tallest tower, the Tower of Dread, thinking they'd be safe deep inside all that stone. They were wrong. The stone was thick, but it conducted heat. The fires outside heated the walls, and the walls heated the air inside. The temperature rose and rose. Harren and his sons felt it happening. They tried to escape, but every stairway was blocked by fire or melting stone. They were trapped in the very fortress Harren had built to be invincible. By midnight, House Horror was extinct. Harren and all his male heirs died in the tower they'd built to last forever. By dawn, the fires had burned themselves out. The 5 towers still stood, but they were twisted and blackened, melted like candles that had burned too long. The walls had cracked from the heat. Parts of the castle had collapsed. Harrenhal would never be whole again. Even today, 300 years later, the towers stand as a warning. Stone does not burn, Harren had said. He was technically correct, but it melts, and that was enough. Edmund Tully knelt before Aegon beside the smoking ruins. Every other river lord followed. Aegon named Tully Lord Paramount of the Trident, making him the highest lord in the Riverlands, responsible only to the Iron Throne. The river lords cheered. They'd been freed from Harren's tyranny, and it had taken only one night. Songs would be written about this moment for centuries. The night the greatest castle in Westeros fell to dragonfire. Aegon accepted their oaths, and then did something unexpected. He forgave everyone. Even the minor lords who'd served Harren faithfully, who'd helped him oppress the Riverlands, were allowed to keep their lands if they swore loyalty now. Aegon understood something important. He needed to build a kingdom, not just win battles. If he punished everyone who'd ever opposed him, he'd create generations of resentment and rebellion. But if he was merciful, if he rewarded those who swore loyalty regardless of their past, he'd earn genuine devotion. It worked. The River Lords became some of Aegon's most loyal supporters. They'd been conquered by Harren and liberated by Aegon in the same stroke. They saw him as a savior, not an invader. For 300 years, the Riverlands would remain faithful to House Targaryen, remembering the night Aegon freed them from the Black King. While Aegon dealt with Harren, Rhaenys had flown south with Meraxes and most of the army. Her target was Argilac the Arrogant, the Storm King, who'd insulted Aegon and started this whole war. Argilac had spent the week since sending his insulting message, gathering his strength. He called his banners, summoning every lord and knight in the Stormlands to Storm's End. He planned to meet the Targaryens in open battle and crush them before they could become a real threat. But Argilac made a mistake. He decided not to wait behind his castle walls. Storm's End had never fallen in its entire history. He could have stayed safe there, forcing Aegon to besiege the castle for years. But Argilac was a proud warrior, a man who'd spent his entire life fighting with honor and courage. Hiding behind walls felt like cowardice. If he was going to die, and at 70 years old, he knew death was coming soon anyway. He wanted to die with a sword in his hand, facing his enemies like a true king should. So Argilac rode out to meet Rhaenys. The last Storm King could have stayed safe behind his walls. He rode out instead, sword in hand. The two armies met on a hillside south of Storm's End. It had been raining for 3 days straight, the kind of heavy, relentless rain that turns roads into rivers and fields into mud. The ground was soft and treacherous. Horses sank to their ankles with every step. Men slipped and fell trying to march in formation. It was miserable weather for a battle, but Argilac thought it might work in his favor. He knew the land. His men were used to fighting in storms. The Targaryens were foreigners who'd probably never seen rain like this. Argilac's plan was straightforward and bold. He had more men, about 11,000 to Orys Baratheon's 5,000. His cavalry was strong, made up of knights who'd been training for war their entire lives. He would hit the Targaryen lines with 3 massive cavalry charges, breaking their formation and creating chaos. Then he'd lead a final push personally, cutting through the broken ranks to reach Orys himself, kill the enemy commander, and the battle was won. The armies formed up on opposite hillsides with a valley between them. The Stormlanders held the higher ground to the south. Orys positioned his forces on the northern hill, with infantry in the center and archers on the flanks. Rhaenys and Meraxes circled overhead, but they stayed high, hidden in the storm clouds. Argilac could barely see them. That was intentional. Rhaenys was waiting for the right moment. The battle began at midday, though you couldn't tell from the gray sky. Argilac gave the signal, and his cavalry charged down the hill. 3,000 knights on horseback, lances lowered, shouting their battle cries. It should have been devastating. A cavalry charge down a hillside builds incredible speed and force. Infantry standing at the bottom usually breaks and runs before the horses even arrive, but the mud changed everything. The horses charged down the hill and immediately started slipping. Some fell, others slowed to a walk, struggling to keep their footing. The neat formation dissolved into a scattered mess. By the time they reached Orys's lines, they'd lost most of their momentum. Orys's infantry held firm behind their shields, pikes raised at an angle to catch the horses. The charge crashed into the shield wall and stalled. Men fought and died in the mud, but the line didn't break. Argilac pulled his cavalry back and regrouped. 3 times Argilac charged up the muddy hills. 3 times the rain and fire drove his knights back. He tried a different angle on the second charge, coming at Orys's flank. The result was the same. Mud and shields stopped the attack cold. On the third charge, Argilac led personally, riding at the front with his crown on his head and his sword raised high. His men followed him with desperate courage, knowing their king was risking everything. They almost broke through. For a moment, it looked like Argilac might actually reach Orys. The Stormlanders pushed forward, step by bloody step, driving the Targaryen infantry back. Then Meraxes dove out of the clouds like a bolt of lightning made flesh. Rhaenys had been watching the battle from above, waiting for the moment when both armies were fully committed. When she saw Argilac's third charge beginning to succeed, she gave Meraxes the command. The dragon folded her wings and dove, dropping like a stone toward the battlefield. She leveled out just 20 feet above the ground and unleashed fire across the Stormlander lines. The effect was instant and catastrophic. Horses panicked, rearing and throwing their riders. Men scattered in every direction trying to escape the flames. The neat battle lines dissolved into chaos. Soldiers trampled each other trying to run. Knights abandoned their posts. The Stormlander army didn't just retreat, it shattered. Within minutes, 11,000 men had become a mob of individuals, all trying to save themselves. Orys saw his opportunity and pressed the attack. His infantry, fresh and organized, surged forward into the broken Stormlander ranks. It became a rout. The Storm King's army was destroyed not by superior numbers or better tactics, but by panic and dragonfire. Hundreds died. Thousands threw down their weapons and surrendered. Others fled into the countryside, hoping to disappear before they were captured. Argilac Durrandon watched his army collapse around him. He was 70 years old, exhausted from 3 charges up and down a muddy hillside. Soaked to the skin from the rain, he could have run. His guards urged him to retreat to Storm's End, to regroup and fight another day, but Argilac refused. He'd said he would die with honor, and he meant it. If this was his last battle, he would end it properly. He spurred his horse toward Orys Baratheon, shouting a challenge. It was an ancient tradition, single combat between champions. Winner takes all. It wouldn't stop the war, but it might end the battle with dignity instead of slaughter. Orys accepted. The 2 armies, what remained of them, stopped fighting to watch. They met in the mud between the lines. Argilac dismounted, drawing his sword. Orys did the same. For a moment, they just looked at each other. A 70-year-old king at the end of his reign, and a young champion fighting for a new dynasty. Then they began. Argilac was slower than he'd been in his youth, but he was still dangerous. He'd been fighting for 50 years. His sword work was economical and precise, no wasted motion. He knew every trick, every feint, every way to create an opening. For the first few exchanges, he actually had the advantage. Orys was younger and faster, but Argilac was smarter and more experienced. They fought in silence, except for the clang of steel on steel and their heavy breathing. The rain kept falling, making everything slippery. Both men were tired. The fight went on for minutes. a long time for single combat, where most duels are decided in seconds. Argilac pressed forward, trying to use his greater strength. Orys gave ground, waiting for an opening. Then Argilac's foot slipped in the mud. Just for a second, he lost his balance. It was enough. Orys's blade found the gap between Argilac's helmet and breastplate, sliding into the soft flesh of his throat. The Storm King fell to his knees, blood pouring down his chest. He dropped his sword and looked up at Orys with something that might have been respect. Then he fell forward into the mud and died. Orys stood over the body, breathing hard, not celebrating. He'd respected Argilac. The old king had died bravely, refusing to hide, choosing honor over safety. Orys cleaned his blade and sheathed it. He ordered his men to treat Argilac's body with respect, wash it, dress it properly, prepare it for burial. The Storm King would be honored in death, even if he'd been defeated in life. The surviving Stormlanders bent the knee. What else could they do? Their king was dead, their army was scattered, and a dragon circled overhead. They swore their loyalty to Aegon Targaryen and marched home. Storm's End itself remained unbreached. The castle garrison prepared to hold out, but their resolve didn't last long. Argilac's daughter Argella declared herself Storm Queen and said she would defend the castle to her last breath. She was 19 years old, beautiful and fierce, her father's daughter in every way. She ordered the gates barred and the walls manned. She swore she would never surrender to the Targaryens. The garrison respected her courage, but they also remembered what had happened to Harrenhal. They'd seen Meraxes burn their army. They knew Balerion was even larger. Did they really want to die defending a girl's pride? The garrison made a hard choice. They seized Argella in her chambers, stripped her naked, bound her in chains, and presented her to Orys Baratheon outside the gates. They thought it was what he wanted, a humiliated prisoner, broken and defeated. They thought he'd be pleased. They were completely wrong. Orys was furious. He had the garrison leaders whipped for their betrayal and dismissed them from service. Then he approached Argella, who was trying not to cry from shame and rage. He took off his own cloak and wrapped it around her, covering her. He unchained her personally, speaking gently. He told her about her father's courage in battle, how bravely Argilac had fought, how he died with honor. He told her that Argilac had earned respect, not mockery, and his daughter deserved the same. Then Orys asked Argella to marry him, not as a prisoner to a captor, not as a prize of war, but as a partner. He promised to honor her father's memory. He promised to take the Durrandon crowned stag as his own sigil, so that House Durrandon would live on through House Baratheon. He promised that Storm's End would remain the seat of her family, just under a new name. This is where Orys Baratheon showed why Aegon trusted him. Argella could have said no. She could have refused and been sent to Dragonstone as a hostage. But Orys's kindness broke through her anger. He'd shown her dignity when her own men had humiliated her. He'd honored her father when he could have mocked a defeated enemy. He'd offered partnership when he could have demanded submission. Argella agreed to the marriage. House Baratheon was founded that day, born from respect and mercy instead of conquest and cruelty. Orys took the Durrandon sigil and words, "Ours is the fury," as his own. He married Argella in a ceremony that mixed old and new traditions. The Stormlanders accepted him because he'd proven himself worthy. He'd defeated their king fairly in combat, and then he'd shown mercy to their princess. That kind of honor meant something. For 300 years, House Baratheon would serve House Targaryen loyally. They would be the king's strongest supporters, providing warriors and advisors, and eventually producing Robert Baratheon, who would overthrow the Mad King and take the Iron Throne himself. But that's a different story. Right now, the Stormlands had fallen, and Aegon had gained both a kingdom and a template for how to win loyalty through mercy. As Storm's End surrendered, two even greater kings were joining their armies together in the west. King Myrnin of the Reach and King Loren Pur of the Rock had been enemies for generations. Their kingdoms had fought each other for hundreds of years, warring over borders and rivers and trade routes. The lords of Highgarden and the lords of Casterly Rock hated each other with a passion that went back centuries. Under normal circumstances, they would never cooperate, but these weren't normal circumstances. They'd both heard what happened to Harren. They'd both heard about Argilac's death. They'd both seen their world changing as the Targaryens conquered kingdom after kingdom in a matter of months. Separately, they would fall like everyone else. Together, they might have a chance. King Loren of Casterly Rock reached out to King Myrn of Highgarden with a proposal. Put aside our differences, combine our armies, and face this threat together. We can settle our disputes later. Right now, we need to survive. Myrn agreed. It must have been a difficult decision for both of them, setting aside generations of hatred. But fear makes strange allies. They gathered their forces. The Reach was the most populous kingdom in Westeros, with the most knights and the best cavalry. The Westerlands were the richest, with gold mines that never seemed to run dry and ironworks that produced the finest weapons and armor. Together, their combined army was enormous. 55,000 men, 55,000 knights, soldiers, archers, and infantry, the largest army Westeros had ever seen assembled in one place. They marched east to meet Aegon, confident in their numbers. The math seemed simple. Aegon had maybe 8,000 men, even counting all the forces that had bent the knee. 55,000 against 8,000 wasn't a battle. It was a massacre. Numbers like that should have been overwhelming, but then numbers had seemed overwhelming to Darkland and Mooten too, and to Harren, and to Argilac. None of them had won. 55,000 men faced 8,000. It should have been a slaughter. And it was, just not the way anyone expected. The two armies met south of Golden Grove, in the Western Reach. The land there was perfect for a battle, flat and open, with fields of wheat and dry grass stretching for miles. It was late summer, and the weather had been hot and dry for weeks. The grass was brown and brittle. The wheat was ready for harvest, but hadn't been cut yet. The fields were like tinder, waiting for a spark. King Lorne commanded the left flank, where the Westerland lords had positioned themselves. He was middle-aged and competent, not brilliant, but solid, with 20 years of experience fighting border wars. King Mern commanded the right flank, where the Reach lords formed up. Mern was older, in his 60s, and he'd brought his sons and heirs with him to learn from the battle. The Gardner dynasty had ruled the Reach for thousands of years. They were proud and confident, certain that their superior numbers would carry the day. They formed their army in a massive block, infantry in the center with heavy cavalry on both flanks. The formation was traditional and sensible. The plan was to advance slowly, letting their superior numbers grind down Aegon's smaller force. The cavalry would sweep around the flanks and encircle the Targaryen army, trapping them against the river behind them. It was textbook warfare, the kind of battle plan that had worked for centuries. Aegon formed his own army in a crescent shape, with the center slightly back from the flanks. It looked defensive, like he was preparing to be surrounded. The combined kings saw this and felt even more confident. The Targaryens were already preparing to defend against the inevitable encirclement. The battle was already won. All they had to do was advance. What Lorne and Mern didn't notice, what they had no way of noticing, was the wind. It was blowing south, from Aegon's position toward theirs. It had been blowing that way all morning. Aegon had waited for it. He'd chosen this battlefield specifically because of the weather patterns. The dry grass, the hot sun, the southward wind, all of it was part of his plan. The wind carried the flames toward the enemy. Aegon had planned it that way. The field, the weather, everything. The armies clashed in the late afternoon. For the first hour, it was a normal battle. Infantry lines met with a crash of shields and swords. Men pushed and stabbed and died. Archers fired, cavalry maneuvered for position. Aegon's crescent formation held firm, giving ground slowly under the pressure of superior numbers. King Mern began to think they might actually win this. The dragons hadn't appeared yet. Maybe the Targaryens were saving them for some reason. Maybe they were afraid of flying too close to 55,000 archers. Either way, this was going to be a grinding, bloody victory, but a victory nonetheless. Then King Mern looked up and saw 3 shadows crossing the sun. All 3 dragons had come, Balerion, Vhagar, and Meraxes, flying in formation, approaching from 3 different directions. This was the first time all 3 dragons had flown into battle together. It would also be the last, and it would show everyone watching why no army on Earth could stand against them. The dragons struck simultaneously, like they'd practiced this. They probably had. Aegon gave the signal, a long blast on a warhorn, and all 3 dragons unleashed fire at the same time, not targeting the Targaryen army's enemies directly, not breathing flame into the packed ranks of soldiers. That would have worked, but Aegon had a better plan. The dragons breathed fire into the dry grass and wheat fields surrounding the combined army. The grass caught instantly. One moment it was just grass, the next it was a wall of flame. The fire spread faster than a man could run, racing through the dry vegetation, consuming everything in its path. The south wind pushed the flames directly toward Lorne and Mern's army. Within seconds, the entire battlefield was burning. Smoke rose in thick black clouds, blinding everyone. The heat became intense, so hot that men couldn't breathe without scorching their lungs. The horses panicked first. They could smell the fire, feel the heat, hear the roar of flames. They reared and bolted, throwing their riders, trampling anyone in their path. The neat cavalry formations dissolved as horses ran in every direction, desperate to escape. Then the infantry broke. When you're standing in the middle of a grass fire that's spreading faster than you can run, with smoke so thick you can't see 3 feet ahead, discipline doesn't matter. Training doesn't matter. All that matters is survival. Men threw down their weapons and ran. They trampled their own comrades, trying to escape. The lucky ones made it to the river behind them and jumped in, swimming to the far shore. The unlucky ones were caught by the flames or suffocated in the smoke. Some knights, wearing full armor, found that their steel was conducting heat. Their armor became ovens, cooking them inside metal suits they couldn't remove fast enough. They collapsed and died, baked alive in the very protection that was supposed to keep them safe. The dragons kept circling, adding more fire, making sure the blaze stayed strong. They didn't need to attack the soldiers directly. The fire did all the work. The battlefield had become a trap, and everyone caught in it died. 4,000 men perished that afternoon. Some burned, some suffocated, some were trampled, some jumped into the river, wearing armor, and drowned because the weight pulled them under. King Mern Nothing Gardner died in the fire, along with his sons and heirs. The entire male line of House Gardner, a dynasty that had ruled the Reach for thousands of years, ended in a single afternoon. One moment they were the most powerful family in the South. The next, they were extinct. The Gardner line that stretched back to the Age of Heroes died in smoke and flame while trying to defend their kingdom. When the fires finally burned themselves out, the battlefield was black and smoking. Ash covered everything. The wheat was gone. The grass was gone. 2 armies had occupied this space hours ago. Now only one remained, Aegon's. King Lorne had survived by running to the river early, before the fire had fully surrounded his position. He'd fought his way to the water and thrown himself in, swimming to the far shore. His armor and crown were gone, lost in the river. He sat on the muddy bank, watching his kingdom burn, and realized he'd lost everything. Aegon found him there the next morning. Lorne expected to be executed. He knelt in the mud and waited for the sword. Instead, Aegon asked him the same question he'd asked everyone else. "Will you kneel?" Lorne looked up, confused. Aegon explained, "Bend the knee, swear your loyalty, keep your lands and your castle, rule the Westerlands in my name, or refuse, and die here." Lorne bent the knee right there in the ashes of the battlefield. He gave up his crown, his independence, his kingdom, but he kept his life, his family, and his castle. House Lannister would continue to rule Casterly Rock, the strongest fortress in the West, wealthiest family in Westeros. They would serve as wardens of the West for 300 years, ruling in the Targaryen name, never forgetting the day they knelt in the ash and smoke. The Reach had no king anymore. Mern was dead, his sons were dead, his brothers were dead, the entire Gardner line was gone. Someone had to rule Highgarden, and the most populous kingdom in Westeros. Aegon chose Harlan Tyrell, who had been the Gardner family's steward. Tyrell wasn't nobility. He was a servant, a man who'd managed the castle and handled the accounts. But he'd opened the gates of Highgarden without a fight, recognizing that resistance was pointless. Aegon rewarded that wisdom by raising House Tyrell from servants to lords, from administrators to kings in all but name. It was brilliant politics. The Tyrells owed everything to Aegon. They had no ancestral claim to the Reach, no ancient right to rule. Everything they had came from Targaryen generosity. They would be loyal because they had to be. If the Targaryens fell, so would they. For 300 years, the Tyrells would serve faithfully, never forgetting that their entire dynasty existed only because Aegon chose them. The Field of Fire became legendary immediately. Singers made songs about it before the smoke had even cleared. It was the moment everyone realized that traditional warfare was over. No matter how many men you had, no matter how good your tactics, no matter how brave your soldiers, none of it mattered against dragons. Fire falling from the sky changed everything. The only winning move was not to fight, but one king in the north had already figured that out. King Lorne survived by bending his knee. His men went home, but in the north, Torrhen Stark was marching with 30,000 swords, and he'd heard what happened here. 30,000 Northmen marched south to face the dragons. Not a single one of them had to die. Torrhen Stark, king in the north, Lord of Winterfell, was 43 years old and considered one of the finest rulers in the North's history. He was tall and stern, with gray eyes that missed nothing. The Starks had ruled the North for 8,000 years, since the Age of Heroes, since the Long Night itself. They'd built the wall with the help of giants and the children of the forest. They'd defended the realms of men from the White Walkers and the others. They remembered things other kingdoms had forgotten. When word reached Winterfell that Aegon Targaryen had landed in the south, Torrhen did what every king in the north had done for thousands of years. He called his banners. Every house in the north answered, from Bear Island in the west to the last hearth in the east, from the wall down to the neck. 30,000 men gathered at Winterfell. It was the largest army the North had ever assembled. They were hard men from a hard land. The North was poor compared to the South. The winters lasted longer, sometimes for years. The land was harsh and unforgiving, but the Northmen were loyal and fierce, bound by duty and honor. When their king called, they came. They brought their axes and their swords and their spears, ready to fight and die if necessary. Torrhen marched south with this army, moving slowly, taking his time. He wasn't rushing into battle like Argilac had. He was thinking, planning, considering his options. Every few days, a raven would arrive with news from the south. Harrenhal had burned, Storm's End had fallen. The Field of Fire had killed 4,000 men in an afternoon. Each piece of news made Torrhen think harder about what he was doing. The two armies met at the southern edge of the neck, with the green fork of the trident between them. Aegon's forces were smaller as always, maybe 10,000 men, with lords from the Riverlands and Stormlands who'd already bent the knee. But 3 dragons slept in the camps, and their presence changed everything. On the north side of the river, 30,000 Northmen waited. They'd marched for weeks. They were ready to fight. Their king just had to give the order, but Torrhen didn't give the order. Not yet. All night, messages passed between the 2 camps. What did Aegon and Torrhen say to each other? Maesters rode back and forth across the river, carrying sealed letters. Torches burned in both camps as lords and advisors debated. No one knows exactly what was discussed. The maesters who carried the messages swore oaths never to reveal what they'd read. Whatever was said, it stayed secret, but we can guess. Some historians believe Aegon told Torrhen about his dream, the vision of the long night returning, the others marching south, the need for the 7 kingdoms to stand united. If that's true, then Torrhen would have believed him immediately. The Starks remembered the long night. They'd fought in it. Their ancestors had helped end it. The wall existed because of what had come before. 8,000 years ago, an endless winter had fallen, and the dead had risen. Humanity had barely survived. If Aegon told Torrhen that the real war was coming from beyond the wall, that the Iron Throne was meant to prepare for that war, that unity was the only way to survive, then everything made sense. This wasn't about conquest for power. This was about survival. The 7 kingdoms needed to be one kingdom when the darkness came again. In the north, more than any other region, understood what that meant. Whether that conversation happened or not, Torrhen made his decision. That night, his brother Brandon Snow came to him with a dangerous proposal. Brandon was a bastard, as clever as he was brave, with nothing to lose and everything to prove. He told Torrhen he'd gathered a small group of men, skilled archers, silent hunters, anyone willing to die for the North. His plan was simple and brutal. Sneak across the river in the darkness, find where the 3 dragons were sleeping, and kill them. Dragons, for all their power, were just flesh and blood. A well-placed arrow in the eye or throat would kill them, same as anything else. The dragons slept at night like all creatures. If Brandon could get close enough, if his men were skilled enough, they might succeed. Kill the 3 dragons, and Aegon was just a man with a small army. Kill the dragons, and the North would win. It wasn't honorable. It wasn't the northern way, but it might work. Torrhen considered his brother's proposal seriously. He could have said yes. He could have sent Brandon across the river that night, risked everything on a desperate gambit, but he said no. The reasons weren't simple. Maybe he thought about honor and didn't want to win through assassination. Maybe he thought the plan would fail and only make things worse. Or maybe, and this is what many believe, maybe Torrhen realized he and Aegon wanted the same thing. The next morning, Torrhen Stark crossed the river alone. He rode to Aegon's camp, dismounted from his horse, and walked forward carrying nothing but his crown. His bannermen watched from across the river, confused and worried. What was their king doing? Torrhen approached Aegon, who stood waiting with Visenya and Rhaenys at his sides. The 3 dragons watched from their hills, curious and alert. Torrhen knelt in the mud. He took off the crown of winter, the ancient bronze circlet his ancestors had worn for 8,000 years, and laid it at Aegon's feet. He said 5 words. "I will serve you, king." The 30,000 Northmen on the far side of the river watched their king surrender without a battle. Some of them wept, some cursed, some couldn't believe what they were seeing. But none of them disobeyed. That was the North's strength, loyalty. Their king had made a choice, and they would follow, even if they didn't understand it, even if it seemed like weakness. Aegon accepted the crown and raised Torrhen to his feet. He gave him a new title, Lord of Winterfell and Warden of the North. The North would keep its laws and customs. The Starks would rule as they always had, administering justice and protecting their people. The only difference was that now they served a greater king, part of a united realm. And critically, and this mattered more than people realized at the time, no northern swords would be melted down for the Iron Throne. The North had not fought, and so they had not lost. Their weapons stayed whole. This was the promise Aegon made to Torrhen. Your people will be treated with respect. Your traditions will be honored. You'll have autonomy in your own lands. All I ask is your loyalty when I need it. And someday, when the darkness comes from beyond your wall, the 7 kingdoms will stand together to face it. That's what this is for. That's why it matters. Torrhen led his army home. He lived for many more years, ruling the North wisely and well. His people called him the king who knelt, and some meant it as an insult, but most came to see it as wisdom. 30,000 lives saved, the North intact and prosperous. No occupation, no destruction, no punishment, just a change of who wore the highest crown. When the White Walkers did return 300 years later, the North fought beside the South, dragons and wolves side by side. The United Kingdom Aegon built held long enough to matter. While Aegon secured the North through words instead of fire, his sisters faced very different challenges in the Vale and Dorne. 3 kingdoms remained: the Vale, Dorne, and Old Town. 3 queens rode out to claim them. The Vale of Arryn was protected by the Mountains of the Moon on all sides. The only passes through those mountains were narrow and easily defended. The Eyrie, seat of House Arryn, sat at the top of the Giant's Lance, the tallest mountain in the range. To reach it, armies had to climb a winding path up the mountainside that took a full day. The path went through 3 fortified gates: the Stone, the Snow, and the sky. Each gate could hold off an army. Each gate was manned by loyal guards ready to die defending their home. The castle itself was carved into the mountain 700 feet from the summit. It was small. It couldn't hold a large garrison or store supplies for a long siege, but it didn't need to. No one could reach it. The path up was too narrow for siege equipment. Attackers would be exposed for hours, climbing single file, while defenders rained arrows and rocks down on them. The Eyrie was considered the most impregnable castle in Westeros, even more secure than Storm's End or Casterly Rock. Queen Regent Shera Arryn ruled the Vale for her young son, King Ronald. She was beautiful and proud, certain that her mountain fortress made her safe from dragons. After all, what could Aegon do? He couldn't land an army at the Eyrie. The courtyard was too small for troops to gather. He couldn't siege the castle because there was no way to surround it. Dragons were terrifying on a battlefield. But here they were useless. She was wrong. Visenya simply flew over all the defenses and landed directly in the courtyard. One morning, Queen Shera was in the High Hall with her son Ronald, discussing the news from the south with her counselors. They were debating whether to send aid to the other kingdoms or stay neutral. Then someone ran in shouting that there was a dragon in the courtyard. Shera rushed outside and found Vhagar sitting calmly in the center of the small courtyard, her bronze-green scales gleaming in the mountain sunlight. Visenya dismounted and walked toward the hall. She wasn't threatening. She wasn't carrying her sword. She just walked calmly, like she'd been invited. The guards didn't know what to do. Should they attack? Should they let her pass? By the time they decided, Visenya was already inside, standing before Queen Shera and King Ronel. The 8-year-old king had never seen a dragon before. He stared at Visenya with wide eyes, not afraid, but amazed. Visenya looked at him and smiled, something she didn't do often. She knelt to be at his eye level and asked him a question. Would you like to fly? Ronel's face lit up. Yes, he said immediately, practically bouncing with excitement. He turned to his mother. Mother, can I fly on the dragon, please? Shera Arryn looked at Visenya and understood the message perfectly. If I wanted to, I could have taken your son anywhere. I could have flown him to Dragonstone and held him hostage. I could have dropped him from the sky. I could have burned this castle from the inside. Your walls and gates mean nothing when I can land directly in your courtyard. But instead, I'm asking permission. I'm being courteous. I'm giving you a choice. Visenya took young Ronald up on Vhagar's back and flew him around the Vale for an hour. They soared over the mountains, dove through clouds, circled the Eyrie 3 times. Ronald laughed with pure joy, the kind of happiness only a child can feel. When they landed, the boy ran to his mother and begged, "Can I fly again? Please, mother? It was amazing. I want to fly every day." Shera looked at her son's happy face, then at Visenya's calm expression, then at the dragon sitting in her courtyard. She made the only choice that made sense. That afternoon, she gathered the lords of the Vale in the High Hall and announced that the Vale would bend the knee to Aegon Targaryen. She handed over 3 crowns, hers, Ronald's, and the ancient Arryn crown that dated back thousands of years. Visenya accepted them graciously. She promised that Ronald would remain Lord of the Vale, that the Arryns would keep their lands and titles, that nothing would change except who wore the highest crown. The Vale had been conquered in the gentlest way possible, with a child's laughter and the implicit threat of dragonfire. Not a drop of blood was spilled. Visenya flew back to the Aegon fort carrying 3 crowns and the loyalty of an entire kingdom. Dorne was different. Dorne was always different. Rhaenys flew south on Meraxes and found empty castles everywhere. Princess Maria Martell, who ruled Dorne, was 80 years old, fat, nearly blind, and probably the cleverest ruler in Westeros. She'd heard what happened to every other kingdom. She knew she couldn't beat the dragons in open battle or withstand a siege, so she didn't try. Instead, she did something no one else had thought of. She disappeared. Every castle Rhaenys visited was abandoned. Sunspear, the seat of House Martell, was empty. The Shadow City that surrounded it was empty. Every tower and holdfast across Dorne, empty. The soldiers had melted into the deserts and mountains. The common people had hidden in caves and oases. There was nothing to burn, no one to fight, no armies to destroy. Rhaenys spent weeks flying across Dorne, searching. She finally found Maria Martell at Sunspear, but only because Maria wanted to be found. The old princess sat in her tower, waiting calmly, attended by a handful of servants. When Rhaenys arrived, Maria received her with courtesy, as if this were a friendly visit. They talked for hours. Rhaenys explained that every other kingdom had bent the knee. She showed Maria the 6 crowns she'd already collected. She pointed out that Dorne was surrounded by Targaryen territory now. She could burn every castle in Dorne one by one. She could hunt down every Martell until none remained. Maria listened politely and then gave one of the most famous responses in history. "I will not fight you," Maria said, "nor will I kneel to you. You may burn my castles if you wish. They're made of stone and sand. They'll rebuild. You may kill some of us. Others will survive and fade into the deserts where your dragons cannot find them. The sands of Dorne have swallowed armies before. How many people can you kill? How many castles can you burn? And at the end of it, we'll still be here, unbowed and unbroken, waiting. Your dragons will eventually die. Mine won't." It was brilliant defiance. Maria had found the one strategy that dragons couldn't counter: refused to fight, refused to gather in one place, refused to give Aegon a target. The Dornish would resist through absence, through patience, through survival. You can't conquer people who won't stand still to be conquered. Rhaenys was frustrated but also impressed. She recognized a stalemate when she saw one. She could burn Sunspear, but Maria would just move to another castle. She could hunt the Martells, but Dorne was huge and full of places to hide. She could kill thousands, but thousands more would remain, and each death would create more resentment and resistance. The conquest would cost more than it was worth, so Rhaenys and Maria exchanged house words as a gesture of mutual respect. "Unbowed, unbent, unbroken," said Maria, reminding Rhaenys that Dorne would never truly submit. "Fire and blood," replied Rhaenys, reminding Maria that the option for conquest was always there. Then Rhaenys climbed on Meraxes and flew north, leaving Dorne unconquered. It would remain that way for more than 160 years. Dorne would be a constant thorn in the Targaryen side, raiding, resisting, refusing to bend. Eventually Dorne would join the Seven Kingdoms through marriage rather than conquest, but that wouldn't happen for generations. Will Dorne ever bend the knee? Yes, but only on its own terms, only when it chooses to. And that made Dorne special, the one kingdom that resisted successfully. The last kingdom to submit was the Reach, or what was left of it after Mern Gardner died at the Field of Fire. Harlan Tyrell had opened the gates of Highgarden without resistance, and Aegon had rewarded him by making House Tyrell the new ruling family of the Reach. But there was one more piece to secure: Old Town. Old Town was the oldest, largest, and richest city in Westeros. It had been a great city when the first men arrived, and it had only grown larger over the centuries. The High Tower, the massive lighthouse that overlooked the city, was one of the tallest structures ever built, taller than the Wall, taller than any castle, visible for miles in every direction. The city held the Citadel, where Maesters were trained, and it held the Starry Sept, the holiest building in Westeros, the center of the faith of the Seven. Lord Hightower ruled Old Town, but he was wise enough to know when to bend. More importantly, the High Septon, the leader of the faith, the voice of the Seven Gods, lived in Old Town. The High Septon's word carried enormous weight. If he declared against Aegon, millions of faithful believers would resist. If he blessed Aegon, resistance would crumble. When news reached Old Town that Aegon was coming, the High Septon locked himself in the Starry Sept for 7 days and 7 nights. He prayed continuously, asking the gods for guidance. Should he call for holy war against the Targaryens? Should he rally the faithful to resist the dragons? The faith had power, not military power, but spiritual power. A holy war could tear the continent apart, making conquest impossible even with dragons. On the 7th day, the High Septon emerged. He called Lord Hightower and the most powerful lords of the Reach to the Starry Sept. He told them he'd received a vision from the crone, one of the 7 faces of God. The crone had lifted her lamp and shown him the path forward. The gods had made their will known. Aegon Targaryen was meant to rule. Resisting him would be resisting the will of the gods themselves. Whether the High Septon truly had a vision, or simply recognized that resistance was futile, we'll never know. But his decision changed everything. Lord Hightower opened the gates of Old Town without a fight. When Aegon arrived on Balerion, he found a city at peace, ready to welcome him. The High Septon himself came out to greet him, blessing him in the name of the Seven. This was crucial. Aegon had conquered through fire and blood, but he needed more than military victory. He needed legitimacy. He needed the people to believe he had a right to rule. The High Septon's blessing gave him that. If the gods approved, if the faith blessed his reign, then Aegon wasn't just a conqueror, he was the rightful king. The lords who bent the knee weren't betraying their old kings. They were following divine will. 6 kingdoms had bowed, 1 had refused, but Aegon had achieved what everyone said was impossible. He'd united the 7 kingdoms, or at least 6 of them, under one crown in just 2 years. Now came the hard parts, turning military conquest into lasting rule. 6 kingdoms bowed, 1 refused, but Aegon had a throne to build from the swords of his fallen enemies. The conquest was over. 2 years from the day Aegon landed at the mouth of the Blackwater, Westeros had been transformed. 7 warring kingdoms had become one realm. Thousands had died, but millions more would live in peace because of it. Now Aegon needed to create symbols and structures that would make his reign permanent. He needed the Iron Throne. Aegon sent riders to every battlefield, every burned castle, every place where men had died fighting him. He ordered them to collect the weapons of the fallen, Every sword, every spear, every knife. Thousands of weapons came to the Aegon fort from across the continent. Swords that had been wielded by knights and kings, spears carried by foot soldiers, daggers hidden by assassins. All the metal that had been used to oppose him gathered in one place. Then Aegon made an announcement. He would forge a throne from these weapons, melted together by dragonfire. It would be a symbol of his conquest and a warning to anyone who thought about rebelling. The throne would be uncomfortable, full of sharp edges and points. Aegon wanted it that way. He said a king should never sit easy. A king who sits comfortable makes lazy decisions. A king who must always be aware of the blades beneath and around him will rule carefully. For 59 days, Valyrian melted swords. Every morning, the great black dragon would breathe fire on the pile of weapons, heating them until they glowed white hot and began to run like water. Smiths worked while the metal was soft, folding it, shaping it, building the throne layer by layer. It was dangerous work. Several smiths were burned. One died when a drop of molten steel fell on him, but they continued, driven by the knowledge that they were creating something that would last for centuries. The Iron Throne grew slowly. The seat was formed from hundreds of swords melted together, their blades pointing in every direction. The armrests were crossed swords. The back towered high, made from long swords and great swords arranged in a fan pattern. Steps led up to the seat, each step made from twisted blades. The whole thing was massive, asymmetrical, dangerous looking. It was uncomfortable to sit on. Several kings would cut themselves on it over the centuries, leading to the saying that the Iron Throne rejects unworthy kings. When it was finished, Aegon had it installed in the throne room of the Red Keep, though the Red Keep itself wouldn't be completed for decades. For now, it sat in a large hall in the expanding Aegon fort. Lords came from across the realm to see it, and they left uneasy. The throne was a monument to conquest, a reminder that Aegon had defeated everyone, that every blade in the throne had belonged to someone who'd opposed him. It was brilliant propaganda, intimidating, impressive, and impossible to ignore. But Aegon needed more than a scary throne. He needed the blessing of the gods, the acceptance of the people, the legitimacy that comes from proper ceremony. So he traveled to Old Town, to the Starry Sept, to be crowned again by the High Septon. Every sword from every fallen enemy melted together into one terrible seat, the Iron Throne. The second coronation was different from the first. The first had been practical, Aegon crowning himself on a battlefield, claiming power because he had the strength to take it. The second was spiritual and political. In the Starry Sept, the oldest and most sacred building in Westeros, before thousands of witnesses, the High Septon anointed Aegon with 7 oils in the name of the 7 gods. The ceremony took hours. The High Septon blessed Aegon in the name of the Father, for justice, in the name of the Mother, for mercy, in the name of the warrior, for strength in battle, in the name of the maiden, for innocence and protection of the innocent, in the name of the smith, for building and crafting the realm, in the name of the crone, for wisdom, in the name of the stranger, for death and the unknown future. 7 blessings for 7 kingdoms, all united now under one crown. Then the High Septon crowned Aegon with a crown of Valyrian steel, forged specifically for this moment. He proclaimed Aegon's full titles for the first time. Aegon of the House Targaryen, the first of his name, King of the Andals, the Rhoynar, and the First Men, Lord of the 7 Kingdoms, and Protector of the Realm. It was the longest list of titles any ruler in Westeros had ever claimed, and every word was true. Lords from all 6 kingdoms that had bent the knee attended. They knelt together and swore their oaths again, publicly, before gods and men. The Starks from the north, the Aarons from the Vale, the Tullys from the Riverlands, the Lannisters from the west, the Baratheons from the Stormlands, the Tyrells from the Reach. Each great house swore loyalty, each promised to serve, and Aegon swore in return to rule justly, to protect the weak, to defend the realm from all threats. After the ceremony, Aegon made his first major policy decision. The capital of his new realm would be King's Landing, not Old Town or Dragonstone. Old Town was too far south, too associated with the Reach and the Faith. Dragonstone was isolated and small, suitable for a Dragon Lord's seat, but not for ruling a continent. King's Landing sat in the center of everything, accessible by both land and sea. It was where Aegon had first landed. It was where the 3 hills bore the names of the conquerors. It would be the heart of the new realm. Construction began immediately on what would become the Red Keep, a massive castle complex that would take more than 30 years to complete. Aegon wouldn't live to see it finished, but he saw the foundations laid, the walls beginning to rise. He saw King's Landing transform from 3 fishing villages into a real city. People came from all over Westeros, seeking opportunity in the new capital. Merchants opened shops. Craftsmen offered their services. The city grew organically, messily, quickly, becoming one of the largest cities in the known world within a generation. Aegon established the small council to help him govern. 6 advisors, each responsible for a different aspect of ruling the realm. The hand of the king, who would serve as the king's deputy and chief administrator, the master of coin, who would manage the treasury and economy, the master of laws, who would oversee justice and interpret the law, the master of ships, who would command the royal fleet, the Grand Maester, who would advise on history and learning, and the Lord Commander of the King's Guard, who would protect the king's life. The King's Guard was Visenya's creation. She'd witnessed several attempts to assassinate Aegon during the conquest. Nothing serious, mostly desperate acts by lords who'd lost everything. But she recognized the danger. Kings needed protection, not just from enemies on the battlefield, but from assassins and traitors close by. So she proposed creating an order of 7 knights who would swear lifelong oaths to protect the king and his family. They would wear white cloaks and white armor. They would never marry, hold lands, or father children. They would serve until death. The King's Guard would become one of the most famous institutions in Westeros, producing legendary knights and tragic failures in equal measure. Aegon ruled for 37 years after the conquest ended. He was generally considered a decent king, not great, but not terrible. He traveled the realm extensively, showing himself to his people, hearing petitions, settling disputes. He built roads to connect the kingdoms. He standardized laws where it made sense while allowing regional variations where local custom was strong. He kept the peace between the great houses, mediating their disputes, preventing the kind of large-scale warfare that had plagued Westeros for millennia. He never forgot why he'd conquered. Aegon didn't conquer for power. He conquered because he'd seen a great winter coming, a darkness that would swallow everything unless the kingdom stood together. The dream never left him. Even after 3 decades of peaceful rule, even after the immediate threats had passed, Aegon remembered the vision. He told his children about it. Rhaenys, his son with Rhaenys, and Maegor, his son with Visenya. He made them promise to remember. The wall must be defended. The Night's Watch must be supported. The realm must stay united, because someday the darkness would come. His children didn't fully understand. How could they? They'd never had the dream. They'd never seen the long night in their minds. Never felt the cold terror of that vision. To them, it was just their father's obsession, something he talked about in private, a story that didn't quite make sense. But they promised to remember anyway, because they loved him and respected him. Aegon died in his sleep at age 64, 37 years after the conquest. It was a peaceful death, unusual for a conqueror, but perhaps fitting for someone who'd built more than he'd destroyed. His body was burned on a pyre in the Targaryen tradition, returned to fire as all dragon lords eventually were. His ashes were interred on Dragonstone, beside Visenya and Rhaenys, who died before him. His son, Rhaenys, inherited the Iron Throne, beginning a dynasty that would last nearly 300 years. There would be good Targaryen kings and mad ones, wise queens and cruel princes. The dynasty would eventually collapse in civil war and madness, ending with the Mad King Aerys and Robert's Rebellion. But that's far in the future. Right now, the conquest is complete and the 7 kingdoms are won. 300 years later, when the Night King marched south with his army of the dead, Aegon's dream finally came true. The great winter came, the long night returned. The White Walkers and their whites poured through the wall, just as Aegon had foreseen. And when they came, the 7 kingdoms stood together. Not perfectly. The realm was in chaos after decades of war. Not easily. It took immense sacrifice and loss, but they stood together nonetheless. Dragons returned to fight the dead. Daenerys Targaryen, the last of Aegon's line, brought her children to Westeros and burned the whites by the thousands. Jon Snow, the king in the north, united the northern houses and rallied the defense. The living formed a desperate coalition, northerners and southerners, Stark and Lannister, men of the Night's Watch, and free folk from beyond the wall. All the ancient hatreds were set aside because survival mattered more than grudges. The Battle of Winterfell was the longest night anyone had experienced in 8,000 years. The dead seemed endless. The living were vastly outnumbered, but they held. And in the end, through courage and sacrifice, and a blade in the darkness, the Night King fell. The long night ended. Humanity survived. Aegon hadn't lived to see it. He'd been dead for 300 years. His dynasty had fallen, his empire had fragmented, but the structures he'd built, the unity of the kingdoms, the expectation that threats should be faced together, the idea that all of Westeros was one realm, those structures held long enough to matter. Without Aegon's conquest, without the centuries of unity that followed, the kingdoms would have fallen separately. The North would have died alone while the South ignored them. Humanity would have been destroyed because it couldn't stop fighting itself long enough to face the real enemy. That was the entire story of Aegon Targaryen the Conqueror. He was the man who united a continent not for himself, but for everyone who would come after. He was the man who saw the future and forged it with fire and blood. He was the man who climbed on his dragon, landed on a beach beside 3 empty hills, and changed the world forever. 6 kingdoms fell. Harren's cruelty burned away. Argilac's honor acknowledged. Mern's pride extinguished. Lorne's wisdom rewarded. Torrhen's foresight vindicated. The veil claimed gently, Dorne defiant, and through it all, Aegon built something that would outlast him, a unified realm, ready to face the darkness when it finally came. The three-headed dragon cast its shadow over Westeros for 300 years. Kings and queens rose and fell. Dragons lived and died. The realm prospered and suffered. But when the test finally came, when the darkness marched south, and death itself threatened to swallow the living, Aegon's dream came true. The seven kingdoms stood together. The night was long, but the dawn came again. And in that dawn, everyone who survived could look back and understand. This was why Aegon conquered. This was the point of it all. Not power, not glory, not even justice. Survival. Humanity's survival against a threat that had nearly destroyed it once, before and had returned to try again. Aegon Targaryen died believing his descendants would remember. They mostly forgot, but the realm he built remembered in its bones, in its structures, in the expectation that when something truly threatens everyone, everyone stands together. That was his legacy. That was the entire story of the Conqueror. A man who had a nightmare and spent the rest of his life making sure it wouldn't come true. And 300 years later, through luck and courage and sacrifice, it didn't.